Good morning, everybody. Good morning, members of the public, members and guests to this morning's meeting of the Assembly Police and Crime Committee. Main item business today is our monthly question and answer session, the MPS, and MOPAC. We're delighted today to have Commissioner Metropolitan Cressida Dick, Craig Mackey, and Deputy Mayor Sophie, Linden. I understand for pressing reasons you need to both leave early, and in this case we understand that. Members of the public may wish to follow us on Twitter and take part in the discussion as usual on hashtag Assembly Police Q&A. As ever, can you turn off to silent your mobile devices? Apologies. I don't think we have any, do we?
No, Chairman. I'm sorry, we don't have any.
Sorry to interrupt your water.
Apologies for that. Right,
so we have no apologies. We have a full house this morning, and that's absolutely wonderful. Item 2, can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask Assembly members as usual to disclose any other pecuniary interests and relevant interests that they have not done so far.
Yeah, thank you.
You have the usual item?
Yeah, I've got a flat in the Notting Hill Carnival area.
Okay. Which means you can't vote. It's not a voting issue, but you may quite happily partake in the discussion, which I know you want to do. So thank you for that. That's duly noted. Hi, Flo. Item 3, minutes. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting of the committee held on the 4th of July to be signed by me as a correct record.
3.
Item 4, summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee as listed in the report. Item 5, action under delegated authority. Can I ask the committee to note the recent action taken by me under delegated authority, namely to agree the use of our meeting slot that was on the 18th of July for 2 briefings, the arrangements for our community roundtable on the 24th of July, and our report A Long Way From Home, improving London's response to women in the criminal justice system, please. Can we note our report A Long Way From Home and the summary of our briefings and roundtable meetings, which are set within the report? Thank you very much. Okay, great. Having done that, we can move to the main item of business. And again, I thank very much our guests for coming along and taking the time to meet us this morning. We have a list of questions. I will take the first question, if I may, and introduce that question as counter-terrorism, which is a subject which is very much alive in the minds of Londoners. Most recently, we had on the 14th of August another incident which was described by the Met as a case of terrorism, and the individual has been charged with 2 accounts of attempted murder, I should say. So, Commissioner, welcome again. Could you kindly update us on that incident and also how you may be working also to reassure communities following that incident, please?
Thank you, Chair. As you say, in relation to that matter, one man has been charged with 2 counts of attempted murder, firstly in relation to members of the public and secondly in relation to police officers. Obviously, I need to be careful what I say about a matter that is sub judice, but to reiterate, throughout, we were careful to say that we were treating it as though it was a terrorist incident. And you will have noted the comments of the CPS at the point of charge and their use of Section 30 of the Counter-Terrorism Act 2008. I would want, of course, to pay tribute again to the officers who responded brilliantly at the time, with great courage and massive professionalism, and indeed, I think, the operation that flowed afterwards, which of course involved Parliament and many other stakeholders, ran as well as one could expect in such shocking circumstances. So I don't think I have anything more to say about that matter. Of course, as a result of that, we have, as we always do with any terrorist incident or indeed investigation, been looking at any learning that may come from it, in particular in relation to the protect strand of contest in terms of terrorism. We are working very hard still, and you will have heard the comments of the Director General not so very long ago about the tempo of terrorism investigations the number of current operations, the fact that the last financial year was sadly a record year for arrests, 441. I think the teams are working as hard as they ever have been. In terms of reassurance, we continue with very wide communications through a variety of communities, the business community in particular, but of course faith communities and other communities, Run, Hide, Tell, Action Counters Terrorism, explaining again and again and again how people can best protect themselves, advising on specific protection measures. We have our Operation Servitor running, which, as you know, is designed to detect people who are either intent on terrorism or indeed criminal activity, but provides a high-profile reassurance at the same time. I could go on. It's a huge part of our work.
Indeed.
We encourage the public to support us, and 99.9% of the time we get great support, more and more information coming in, very good use of our hotlines and other methods of reporting.
Helpful, thank you, and reassuring, thank you very much. Going back to the incident in Parliament Square, and you talked about prevention, and part of the prevention there was the physicality of the prevention of the car, any further action. There has been narrative or dialogue elsewhere about potential pedestrianisation of Parliament Square. I neither support, I have no view personally. Yes. Do you have any thoughts around that?
So clearly our job as the police is to advise. We don't make the final decisions on this sort of matter. And as you know, in somewhere like that, there's a number of parties that need to work out what is for the best in the broadest terms. So that includes Parliament, it includes the Mayor, of course, it includes the two local authorities and Transport for London, because as with any protective security, one is trying to balance reasonable security measures with cost and inconvenience, if you like, to normal people wanting to go about their daily business, for including, of course, people who might be wishing to drive. Pedestrianisation is a word which, you know, if anywhere is pedestrianised, it does not of itself protect from a vehicle attack. It needs some barriers as well, and it also, by definition, doesn't protect from another form of attack, for example, the pedestrian who happens to be carrying a knife, the lone attacker with a knife, which is something we have faced at Parliament in the last several months. I commented on the day, and I say it again, Parliament itself is very well protected and has become even more well protected since the ghastly events of last year. And I should note that we have the inquest starting next week into those who lost their lives in that dreadful attack last spring. So the parliamentary estate is well and ever better protected. The question that you're pointing at is what should happen outside. There is a sort of expert group looking at that, and I'm sure sensible decisions will be made in due course as a result of that.
On that specifically, just
specifically. I remember when I was in Parliament this came up before, and
yes.
the real problem was access to carriage gates for MPs and ministers driving from Whitehall to get to a vote. And the only other way vehicles could get in would have been through Blackrod Garden, which is just not practical given all the delivery vans and everything that goes that way. So it is another way of access for MPs and ministers by car being considered as part of the pedestrianisation, and if so, would that provide a weak spot in the proposal?
So the challenge, of course, of proper access to Parliament remains a challenge in whatever plan anybody may come up with. You know, we are founded on the notion of an open Parliament and something that people can visit, and secondly, parliamentarians need to have quick and ready access. You know, should the bell sound, so to speak. So that's something that everybody is trying to take into their calculations. I'm not going to talk about what's happening at the particular gates and things at the moment, Andrew, I'm afraid.
So taking away from that physicality of that place, you've been quoted as saying that the Met more generally is in as good a place as people would expect us to be regarding prevention more generally.
Yes,
is that a fair reflection? On
reflection, it's an odd way of putting it, but I stand by the comment. What I meant was, you know, it's a ghastly, ghastly phenomenon. Yes. You know, terrorism inspired by whatever cause. We cannot reduce the risks to zero. And I was asked to compare this with other types of threat and crime that we have to deal with. We've invested very heavily. We have very good people, very good leaders, lots of support from others, including government. And relatively speaking, I believe, we are in good shape and in a good place, and the teams are in very good heart, and they're doing great work. Just last week, we saw Mr. Rahman sentenced to life with a minimum of 30 years for undertaking an attempt to, a plot to kill the Prime Minister and others. A fantastic piece of police work supported by the agencies, and this is sort of thing is. In terms of the quality of the work, is happening all day long.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. We've got some questions now relating to forms of extremism more generally. I'll bring on mission in a minute, but this is a question really for the Deputy Mayor. You have the Mayor's Countering Violent Extremism programme. Trouble getting that out. What is that, if you can, relatively briefly, new message coming in, what is that doing to ensure it incorporates all forms of extremism across the spectrum, that particular programme, Deputy Mayor?
So just towards the end of last year, we announced that we were setting up a programme around countering violent extremism. That is ongoing, it's up and running. There's been a number of meetings, consultations, discussions and engagements with professionals, stakeholders, but also with communities. I've participated in some of them. The Deputy Mayor for Social Inclusion, Matthew Ryder, is also working with the Mayor on this, because we see this not just as a policing and crime issue, but actually around community cohesion and social inclusion. And so we were really clear when we set this up, as the Mayor was incredibly clear about this. This was about violent extremism in all its forms, and we were very clear in its terms of reference and its programme of work that yes, of course, it takes in so-called Islamist extremism, but absolutely it has to look at extreme right-wing extremism and violence, and that has been very clear in the work that we're doing. I expect when it comes to its conclusions that it will have looked at all forms of extremism and have some recommendations around all forms. It was absolutely part of the programme of work and the principles that this is all-encompassing. It's not just about one particular type of violent extremism.
So it's time limited to the degree that it comes to conclusions, or
yeah.
is that the sort of nature of it? Mm-hmm. And when will that be worked towards?
So the programme's running for the whole of this calendar year.
Right.
So we would expect to be able to come to its conclusions towards the beginning of next year, that we would publish something. But it's running for the whole of this calendar year.
Okay, we'll be looking forward to that. Unmesh, you wanted to come in?
Yes, Chair. Can I just carry on to follow on from where you left off? So, Deputy Mayor, as I understand the Countering Violent Extremism programme, the Mayor, I think, went on record as saying that the funding would be aimed at groups working at a grassroots level, and in particular, I think he stressed the role of women's groups. Now, I haven't heard of the anti-tribalism movement, but I'm aware of the Faith Forum for London. But I mean, these are London-wide bodies. Are you actually aiming to get the money out to groups that actually, as I say, work at the borough level, at what I would call, to repeat, a grassroots community level?
So the programme is taking place and engaging on a number of different levels. It is absolutely some of the Pan-London groups that, such as the Faith Forum, is engaging with, but it is absolutely looking and is working and going out and engaging very locally at local grassroots level. I myself chaired a session with women only with Councillor Claire Cober, which took in all forms of violent extremism to talk to them about their views and their experiences. But we're not just doing that from City Hall, because I'm very aware that City Hall can only get so far and only has a certain reach. So we have actually put a grant out, and we have two organisations who are very, very good at getting right through to the grassroots, to those individuals who would not necessarily normally interact with City Hall, and that is a part of the programme that we're very keen on and have put some money behind to make sure that we get into those local communities.
And what is the anti-tribalism movement?
It's the anti-tribalism movement is one of the one of the two organisations that have been granted this money. It's predominantly with the Somali community, but one of the things in order to get the grant that we have made sure as part of their work is that they are much wider than that, and that they will be engaging with different communities and doing so at a local level, and including specifically making sure that they hear the voices of women in the work that they do, and that they can feed back to us.
And you also talk about this program reaching out to groups that counter all forms of extremism. So have you considered, or are you in the process of funding groups that actually monitor and combat hate coming from the extreme right wing?
We, in terms of the engagement that we are undertaking, we are engaging with all the organisations that we can engage with around extreme right-wing extremist violence. And we are doing that. We are in touch with those organisations and discussing and engaging with them as well. And as part of this, we have a regular meeting reviewing the work to make sure that we are touching all the different elements. So if there are any gaps, which I don't think there are at the moment, we will seek to fill them.
I'll just say this: I'm not going to be an advocate here for particular groups that I'm aware of, but it would help, certainly myself, but the committee, if you could tell us the groups that they are going to engage with in terms of countering far right-wing extremism.
Yeah, absolutely, no problem doing that. Absolutely.
So, coming to my main question, if I can ask you, Commissioner, your former colleague, Assistant Commissioner Mark Rowley, went on record as saying that the UK has not woken up to the threat from the extreme right wing. Do you agree with those comments? And what more is needed to respond to that particular threat?
So you'll remember that this is something that Mark, now Sir Mark, has actually talked about in his final speeches before he left. And he has merely, I think, reiterated in retirement what he was saying before he left. So to speak for the police in the first instance, we absolutely take the threat from extreme right-wing very seriously indeed. And you will be aware that of the 17 plots that were disrupted since March, April last year, 4 of those are lethal plots which emanate from extreme right-wing ideology. 15%, as I understand it, of prevent referrals are extreme right-wing, 30% of channel referrals. You will also be aware that the Anderson review that the Prime Minister and Home Secretary commissioned to provide assurance around the operational reviews that we were doing together with the security service, MI5, that was very clear about the need to make sure across the board that we had the same capabilities and methods of working against extreme right-wing as we did against so-called Islamist-inspired or international terrorism. And we have been putting that, we and the security service have been getting that better and better and better in the last several months. We've also been raising awareness everywhere we go, in all our briefings that we do, whether that's in a school, in a faith institution, in a government meeting. We are busy raising awareness of the nature of the extreme right-wing threat and the changes that we have collectively seen in the last few months. So I think this is very important for the UK. Of course it is. I think we are more than playing our part in raising awareness and making sure that everybody understands that the terrorist threat can come from all sorts of different angles, most particularly in this instance, extreme right wing.
I welcome those comments, Commissioner, and understandably, but you've been sort of very general in your answer. So can I be a bit more specific? We now know that many people convicted or involved in terrorist offences have proven links with groups like Al-Muhajirin. Are there any particular groups on the far right that you have similar concerns about? Very specifically, groups like the English Defence League and with their proven international links. And Sir Mark Rowley did talk about the international links of the far right here. National action has been prescribed. But what are you doing to combat the activities of groups like the EDL and similar outfits?
So we, as you say, the big shift, if you like, is the proscription of national action and then two further prescriptions afterwards, making it very clear that these are, as Mark said, organised terrorist groups which have all the most worrying aspects of organised terrorism. The people who end up in those groups, yes, they come from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of, as far as we can understand, different places in which they have often on the internet started to get their ideas about their political cause that has taken them into a terrorist group. I am not going to say that we think this one is better, worse, more worrying than the others. Of course, we are always interested to see the background of anybody operating in national action, and of course, we keep a close interest in those groups which are sort of on the periphery between far right and extreme right. You would expect us to do that, but always lawfully and in a way that is, legitimate in our society.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. I think and I may even preempt Peter unusually. I think the point is clearly that some groups are either prescribed and illegal and or have indicated or proven illegal acts. Others may just have views and comments that are distasteful, thoroughly unpleasant, but doesn't always necessarily make them illegal. Peter, did you want to embellish that?
I was going to make that
briefly?
point, actually, whether you agree with them or not, and I don't. If you start talking about people like the EDL in terms of terrorism, I think you're onto a real problem, actually. The fact is that I don't know whether you agree with this, Commissioner, but I mean, we might not agree with groups or whatever, but you've got to be careful when you start saying people are terrorists. Can I just ask one question, actually? You're talking about right-wing groups. Totally understand that. You seem very clear on that, Commissioner. Why then, as you just said, do you have to say, extreme right-wing, you have no problem saying that, but then you go on to say so-called Islamist-inspired. Why are you so mealy-mouthed? You just said that, so-called Islamist-inspired. The guy who, for example, last year ran into Westminster and killed, 5 people with his car, was very clear. He was waging jihad. Right. Most of these people have been very, very clear. Why do you have to say so-called Islamists?
So first point, I think it's very important not to call people terrorists who don't show the signs of terrorism. And I absolutely, as the Commissioner of the Met, will defend till my dying day, literally, the best aspects of our country in terms of people being able to express their opinions within the law. I say the phrase so-called Islamist. Sometimes, not always. I'm sorry if it offends you. I say it because I think, as a senior police officer, it is important for me, obviously, not to be mealy-mouthed, but equally not to randomly upset people who might get upset. So I try to pick my words. Now, I've obviously upset you in the way I've described it.
No, we're talking about counter-terrorism.
Yes,
are you actually saying, Commissioner...
Can we not speak across each other, please?
That the majority of people carrying out terrorist attacks, right, 90% are Islam-inspired. We might not like it, you might not like to say that, but it is the case. Why do you say things like so-called Islamists? You're the Commissioner.
Because, Chair, I really don't think we should get into a long conversation about this, not least because you want to push on. But because in the name of Islam is very different from Islamist, for a start. We could get into a really long semantic conversation here, Peter. And I don't want to be annoying.
I agree, Commissioner, but why can't we take them at their word? Why is it so difficult to take them at their word?
So obviously there are terrorists who have said they are doing this to take forward what they would describe and other people would describe as Islamist causes. There are other people who some people might call Islamist who actually haven't said that, don't appear to be doing exactly that. It's quite a complicated area.
I agree with you. No, but I want to make this point because this is dissembling. The fact is, the vast bulk of terrorist attacks, whether it is 7/7, whether it's Westminster, whether it was in Manchester, whether it was in Borough, are Islam-inspired, Commissioner. And I mean, the fact is, you have got to face up to this. You're quite clear about what it is with right-wing extremism. I wish you would be as explicit about this.
But that's enough. I don't think you need to... I think you said your piece. I have some sympathy with your analysis. And I'm glad you had that opportunity. Len, do you want to say something briefly? And then we'll move on.
Chair, can I ask for a bit more an in-depth report about the work that MOPAC are undertaking on the counter-extremist and violent programme, and can we have that shared amongst the committee? So a bit more about who we're talking to, when, timescales and everything else. So I think we should have a formal report back on your briefing if we can. Yeah. Some of the questions, I'm conscious of the time. If I can move.
Can I just say, I'm really happy to do that, but it might be easier just to organise a briefing.
Yeah, we have in hand a briefing diarised, to be diarised.
Commissioner, first of all, can I just you know, because I don't think we can say this enough, and I don't think we say it clearly enough. Thank you for your officers' work in protecting the communities of London and in the wider parts of the country. So thank you for that in this particular unique piece of work that the MPS carries out, and long may it do so, because I believe that's in the interest of not just London, but in the UK. Right. In terms of the pressures that you're facing, and really, I suppose, I just want to think through, because I think it's people generalise too often about some of the issues about that you're facing. It's straightforward. This is it. These are the target committees. And I was very much taken by what you said. And we really do need to thank people coming forward with information, because the nature of the prevention work that you've done, and even though we've not had successes, we've had lots of successes. Do you know what I mean? We can't eliminate the threat completely. There will always be some that will get through. But the many that haven't have been down to the work of your officers, work of other agencies, and the work of people coming forward. So I really do think we should recognise that. And just understanding the pressures that you face and realising where you are in an old range of agencies working. So we face the pressures from Al-Qaeda, Daesh, IS, which are different, and we need to understand there are different forms of threat that we face there. Far-right neo-Nazis, what we should call not just domestic, but those international links that pose a further pressure in the way that we investigate those crimes. And of course, there will always be a watching brief about extreme Irish republicanism. We see rising tensions in Northern Ireland at this moment in time for all sorts of reasons. And of course, that can always come onto the mainland UK. And then what we all seem to forget, but is really must be taking up a load of time, state-sponsored terrorism, Salisbury, Russia. The evidence points to around that in terms of some of the times and calls. If we look over the horizon and in the future about, this is more for other agencies but may well come up here, the nature of some of the tensions within the Middle East between different blocks. I'm thinking of the Saudi bloc versus the Iranian bloc. Can you foresee, or do we always have to prepare, our agencies prepared for the issues that some of that may overspill onto the European continent, onto the UK mainland, and therefore is a major piece of the work of counter-terrorism of trying to keep ahead of that game. I should also say there is, of course, other domestic extremism, threat to life, as we've seen in the past on some, and to infrastructure that counter-terrorism needs to be mindful of, and that's domestic in some ways. So have I got that about right of where those pressures are on the services? Have I missed anything? And about how do you in juggling all these balls and the resources that go with it?
So I think you have got it absolutely right, Len. At any one time, amongst the things you have mentioned, some of them are taking up more or less proportion of the time. And labels are awkward and sometimes unhelpful. So, a large proportion of what we were just talking about, and indeed you have just mentioned, might be put under the label of international counterterrorism. But of course, we know that a lot of the people who carry it out are individuals here who've just been inspired by something they've seen on the net, not directed, these are very difficult people to deal with. The label is hard. And the amount of effort we have to put into different things goes up and down, and yes, we have to do a lot of forward scanning. There are other groups, I'm not going to name them all, but you would expect that, both so-called domestically and in the international sphere, that have challenges or potential threats or fundraising in London. So we are constantly scanning across the whole, constantly looking forward. The good thing about the way we are constructed in the UK, as you know, is that we do have excellent relationships with the intelligence agencies and wider government. I and Neil Bassoon know everything they know. There is no challenge there whatsoever. That's getting, the integration is getting better and better every day, but it's a very strong position that we've come from. And we have the Joint Terrorist Analysis Centre, which looks across the spectrum and doesn't apply labels that might be unhelpful. It just looks across the spectrum and tells us short, medium, long term, and it gets harder as you look further out, what are the emerging threats and what are the current threats and how should we think about those. And that is an agreed position that we can all influence, but is agreed right across UK CT community, including the police. I believe that's a very strong framework for us to work in. But yes, there are pressures from all directions. And you mentioned the hostile state one, and of course that has never gone away, but is one that is something that is very much on the UK government's radar.
Thank you.
Right, thank you for that. We'll move on to the next subject, which is Notting Hill Carnival. Over August, we had Carnival. The early conclusions are that the number of arrests were similar, but pleasingly far less life-threatening incidents. And Commander Musker, who I have the utmost respect for, said that he had seen one of the smoothest and most efficient carnivals that he'd experienced. However, of course, there were regretfully 30 police officers injured, and with a complement of something like 7,000 officers over that weekend, and those injuries are unacceptable. So we have some questions around Notting Hill, unless you're going to lead.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Commissioner, I attended the early morning briefing on Saturday morning, and also, which was impressive, just like the last 2 years. And I also attended for the first time the briefing, not the briefing, but the operation room where the events liaison team were based. And again, that was impressive to see how all the different agencies were working together, the council, the fire service, the police, and the local councils. Can I ask you, Commissioner, what is your assessment of the success of Carnival this year from a policing perspective, putting that in the context of the policing needs of London as a whole? So how did you prepare for the impact on ongoing investigations in general policing throughout London with the 7,000 officers who were allocated to Carnival? And I can particularly also ask you to comment on the role that the community stewards played this year.
Certainly, thank you.
So that's in three parts, the specific assessment of Carnival itself, the London-wide implications, and the role of community stewards. And if I come later on to you, Sophie and Craig, about your opinion of the role of community stewards.
Thank you. So my assessment is that this carnival was safer and more secure than last year's, and that was indeed very much safer than the year before, and I am pleased by that. I should point out, Chair, actually, as always happens with crime figures and other figures, we'll run them again probably definitively and for the last time in about a week's time. But the number of officers that were injured, and we've had injury reports of, is actually higher than the early reports of 30. It's 45. So 30 was unacceptable, 45 is very unacceptable. Yes. These are, I'm relieved to say, minor, if I can put it that way, all horrid but minor in the scheme of things, as I understand it. But some very unpleasant. And you will remember that 2 years ago we had officers, really under a significant life-threatening attack, which is completely unacceptable. So I pay tribute, as Dave Musker has, to the new organisers who I think did take on board a huge amount of what we were concerned about, both in terms of safety and security, and the policing operation itself was a very great success. Proactive operations before Carnival, under the auspices of our Violent Crime Task Force. I think I'm right in saying that in the 6 weeks before, we arrested over 1,000 people for violence-related offences. I'm sure that had a good effect on Carnival. We had the Section 60 order in place, which was Commander Musker's operational decision on Saturday, but very much supported by the organisers, the event organisers, which is very useful for us. We took 36 weapons off the streets and arrested another 70-odd people with offensive weapons, so over 100 weapons taken away from the Carnival footprint, 373 arrests, as you say, for a variety of different things. Excellent planning, excellent hard work with MOPAC and the event organisers and indeed the stewards in the preparation time. I think the particular sort of positive move forwards, if you like, were actually the use of the Section 60, which obviously has to be case specific and time specific, and against the backdrop of what the intelligence that David had and the London summer, if you like, or London's 2018, was, I'm sure, the right decision. It's not for me to second guess it, but I'm not saying we will have one next year. I just think it was a very helpful thing to have. The knife arches were useful. The atmosphere was very good. I was out for about 8 hours on the Monday, and the vast majority of people were in, good humour, good spirits, and very positive about the policing. Every few yards I was stopped by somebody who thanked me for the police presence and the way they were doing their work. The areas which were harder were, despite more stewards and really good stewards, and thanks to the stewards, we probably need even more and even better in the future. Otherwise, police officers end up doing stewards' jobs, which is not good. And despite their best efforts, the event organisers had a problem with getting movement of the floats sufficiently around the carnival footprint. This meant that at the time that the sound systems were closing, a large proportion of the floats, actually, about 30, I think, had at 5 o'clock, so that's before the closure point, but at 5 o'clock, 30 of the floats hadn't got past the judging point. Now, Monday was a very busy day at Carnival. The fact that we had floats arriving late onto the footprint, getting stuck, meant, sadly, that when the sound systems were closed down, and most of the sound systems were managed very well, some with sort of ticketed areas, and sponsorship, which I regard as a good positive move forward as well, people moved from the sound system areas back onto the main carnival route and all around the floats. It's getting dark, it's very crowded. That's frightening and worrying for some people and is a crime generator potentially and a safety issue. So, in the context of better than last year, that's the area that we're most concerned about, and that I know is the area the organisers will be most concerned about for the future. I think it remains an expensive and very big operation for the Met. Your point, 2 million people come and enjoy it, which is wonderful. Something like that. Less this Sunday because it was sadly so wet. Many more on the Monday. But 7,000 odd officers on the Monday, and a few thousand on the Sunday as well. It adds up to a big number of people taken away from policing London. It's not a surprise. We know it's going to happen. We plan for it. We schedule everybody's leave around it, and I pay tribute to the officers. It's quite a difficult atmosphere to work in, despite being very positive. It's very noisy, it's very crowded, sometimes it's very hot. I spoke to officers who were with those floats for 10, 12, 13 hours on Sunday, some of them longer actually, in the heat of the footprint, then coming a few hours sleep, back in, expecting and doing a 12, 14, 16-hour day the next day, on your feet, in that sort of noisy, crowded atmosphere. You ask a lot of people physically, they give a lot, they remain extraordinarily positive and good-humoured. They did a very good job this year, and I'm very proud of them. One thing we did do was try to use the sort of what we would have as reserves in case of difficulties more flexibly across the rest of London, for the violent crime sort of task force work, and that worked very well this year because Carnival was mostly very calm. We were able to release some of the 7,000 for some of the time to help out with the rest of London, and the rest of London had, as it turned out, a good, relatively speaking, August bank holiday weekend. It can be a very challenging weekend. Sorry, I've gone on longer than you would want, Chair, but that's my sort of summary.
So, Chair, I may come back.
Okay, right, I saw Susan next.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I have to say, I think 45 police officers injured is an absolute disgrace, and something, in my view, needs to be done. But can I ask you, how many of those police officers were spat at or bitten?
So we had varying reports on this. Let me just double check my definitive note here. We ended up, I think, with three officers were spat upon. I can tell you a bit more about the circumstances if you would like.
Well, I've heard it's more than that. Are you
So
talking about the ones that were then hospitalised?
Three officers were spat upon in two separate incidents. In the first one, the officer, so this sort of happened, if you like, spontaneously. She was spat at and bitten. Absolutely disgraceful. And obviously resulted in arrest. In the second incident, this was somebody who had a behavioural disorder and started to spit again spontaneously. However, in the first incident, the person went on to spit later over other officers.
And how many officers had to go to hospital because they were either spat at or bitten?
I will come back to you if this is
Okay.
wrong. Susan, sorry, because it would be wrong for me to say a wrong number. But my briefing note
I've got
here,
a figure. I'm wondering
yes,
whether you've
my
got the
briefing
same
note
figure.
here tells me that 3 went to hospital for the preventative checking, testing, and any possible treatment.
Okay, all right. I was told 4, but I mean, even if it was 3.
Yeah.
You said that of the 45 officers that were injured, they were minor injuries. Do you regard being spat at or bitten as a minor situation?
I said a minor, relatively speaking, compared with being, within an inch of your life or kicked and punched. I think most people would regard a spit of itself as a more minor incident. Yes, I think it's a disgusting thing to do. I think it's awful to be on the receiving end of it.
Yep.
And it can be very frightening.
But also, we're talking about biting.
Yeah.
40,000 people in London have got hepatitis C alone. And as you know, this is how it can be transferred.
Horrible.
When these officers are spat and bitten at, they have to go to hospital. Absolutely right. And then the treatment that they have to go through so that they don't get infected is absolutely dreadful. I don't know if either of you have had that misfortune.
I haven't. I've been spat at, absolutely,
No,
and I've been bitten, but before the days of this particular treatment, so I haven't had the treatment.
Well,
just to be clear, they do have to go for the screening. Then it's a very, very much smaller number that actually have the treatment because of the way the screening works and the decisions that the officers
I accept that, but the treatment itself is
horrible.
Absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
It is surely
Aggressive
our
from the
duty to look after these officers as best we can. In fact, it's part of their. I've even looked it up. The personal protective equipment at work, provision of personal protective equipment says that every employer shall ensure that suitable personal protective equipment is provided, and it goes on. I cannot understand. I find it so perverse that we will not issue spit guards to our officers on the street. The frontline officers do want it. The number of them that I've spoken to, they do want it. The public needs to know that it's only if somebody spits at them or bites them first will it be put on. You would have so much support from the public because we need to give our police officers, in my view and in many other people's views, as many tools as they can to keep themselves safe. And the thing is, when these officers have to go through these ghastly treatments, it may only be a few. I don't care, even if it's a few. Their families and their loved ones go through absolute hell, wondering if they have contracted hepatitis C. Now, as I say, given that we've got 40,000 people in London alone with hepatitis C, very often from the groups of people that will be in problems with the police, I cannot understand why we don't supply spit guards to the frontline officers.
The spit guard has been something that has been authorised by the Home Office to be used potentially in policing. for a very long time, since I think about 2006 or 7. The Met did not have spit guards at all until just after I became Commissioner, and as you are aware, we have introduced them after a careful trial in very well scrutinised conditions into all our custody offices, where they are used, I believe, well, rarely, and obviously on every occasion when they are used, there is a supervisor present and checking that it has gone well. Because as you are also aware, I'm sure, Susan, that there is concern in the wider public, amongst some at least, about the use of these guards. Now, all officer safety I take incredibly seriously. Since I've been Commissioner, in fact, before I became Commissioner, and Craig is my witness, the one thing I asked for before I became Commissioner was an uplift in taser, which we have delivered. We have a lot more taser and a lot more to come, and it's better taser, more accurate, better to use, and
well
so
done.
forth. So I've been very clear about that. We are introducing a better baton. We are reviewing and introducing what we hope will be a lighter weight and just as, if not better, protective vest. We are reviewing the use of CS. We're reviewing PAVA. We have, of course, uplifted firearms. I have set out that I want my officers to feel as safe as they reasonably can be, and I take their safety extraordinarily seriously. And however, what I would say is that of all of those issues, you get a wide spectrum of opinion. You get a wide spectrum from the public, you get a wide spectrum amongst officers. So when I go and talk to my officers, I'm quite likely to be asked about taser, and some of them think we need more, and some would say, I wouldn't let, half the people of my colleagues anywhere near a taser. So, likewise, firearms. I don't want to get ridiculous for a sec, but could I just sort of say, obviously the safest thing is if all officers were riding around in, armoured vehicles. That wouldn't be the British police, that wouldn't be effective policing. It would in fact lead in the long run to worse, not better, for them, I am convinced. So everybody has a range of opinions, which is why it remains an operational decision. And in fact, there are some decisions that, although my board will always be consulted and will give a view and usually agree, it is one that I must make myself and do. I am very content, not everybody is, some people think we shouldn't have had spit guards in our custody suites. I'm very content that we have them there, and I am very interested to hear more from the Federation and my officers about the prevalence of the occasions where actually a spit guard would have helped, and why, to examine those to see whether it would in fact have helped. My only concern about it, Susan, I'm really open to this, but my concern about it is that firstly, most of the time when somebody is spat out, however awful it is spontaneous, unexpected, and just happens. A spit guard is not going to help with that at all. That's the huge majority of cases, I believe. Secondly, there are cases where somebody is spitting and or biting, where the very action of trying to get something onto them would of itself, short term possibly, and longer term almost certainly, make the officer more at risk, not less. You can say to me, well, they should be able to judge that, but in the heat of things, it could be really difficult. You've seen some of the violent incidents that our officers are dealing with recently. Imagine being one of them trying to struggle to put a spit guard on at the same time. And finally, there is some concern, which I have listened to from people, for example, who have talked about inquests in which the use of the spit guard has been called into question, which has resulted in, although it didn't result in the death, it has been part of a scenario after police contact, which has been very difficult for the officers to sort of explain. They've been investigated for years and years and years. They've ended up in an inquest, and. So it looks an easy decision. I am open to it. I know Ken Marsh is here today and I'm talking to him about it. But I would say to you, Susan, that in 18 months as Commissioner, my officers have asked me about all kinds of officer safety issues. And in 18 months, until Ken asked the question of the Home Secretary, not one of them had spoken to me about that, or to Craig about it, or to Martin Hewitt, or to Steve House. But they do talk to us about taser, vest, ASP, CS, all sorts of other things.
Thank you.
So I don't think it's the highest priority, but I don't want to sound blithe about this.
Well, if I can just say, I applaud the fact that they're in custody suites. I believe they were used 150 times last year. Now
think
with body cams,
Yeah.
it will help because
Absolutely.
if they are put
No,
on,
good point.
then the safety of the person and
Sure.
the police officer is also there. But I would say to cut the time down, there's 32 forces in the country that do use them, including the BTP who are on the streets
Sure.
of London.
Sure.
And perhaps we could cut the time down if they have got good reasons and good examples, even if it saves
Yes.
one officer from
Yes.
getting hepatitis C or something else. In my personal view, it would be worth it.
Sure. So my lead for this is Matt Twist. He's also the national lead, and he is talking to all the other forces on my behalf as we speak, and I'm talking to Kem to discover what their experience is. I think if you had Matt sitting here, he would say, on balance, if he was the commissioner, he wouldn't be introducing this in London at the moment. I probably shouldn't speak for him, but he wouldn't. For the reasons I have outlined, which is that it might make things very much worse, not better. That's his concern, that it may actually bring more violence and difficulties for officers in the trying to put it
I
on.
think you've said that earlier, Commissioner. Can we? I'd like to try and drag this back to the subject in hand, although, and hopefully it is the subject in hand, Notting Hill, Tony.
Yes. This really is as the Deputy Mayor, and it relates to stop and search. You've just heard the Commissioner say that in relation to the Carnival, that the Section 60 was supported by the community, and clearly the Commissioner thinks that that was effective in keeping down possession of weapons and other things. She suggested that the knife arches also were helpful. You will know that on this side of the chamber we have always supported the extension of the use of stop and search. I see reported in today's Times the Commissioner has said that she's in agreement with the Home Secretary's proposals for extending stop and search. And again, we on this side unequivocally support that. I'm asking you, Deputy Mayor, whether or not you, MOPAC and the Mayor also unequivocally support this use of stop and search.
I will answer that question absolutely straight. But can I just say about Carnival? The Commissioner's talked about the success of Carnival and that it was a lot safer. I've been to Carnival 3 times now and walked the streets of Carnival, looked at the operation, and I was really impressed, incredibly impressed by what I thought was a step change in terms of the partnership working. Congratulate the new event management organisation, the Notting Hill Carnival Trust, and absolutely congratulate the Metropolitan Police for the policing operation in Carnival. But let's not also forget the partnership work from Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster, the Arts Council and London Ambulance Service, because it was a lot safer Carnival. There are more issues to be looked at, as the Commissioner's pointed out, and as usual, the Strategic Partnership Group, which is chaired by MOPAC, will be doing detailed debriefs in order to learn any lessons that need to be learned around crowding or the way the floats went around, so that next year's Carnival can be even safer. On stop and search and the proposals that were floated yesterday from the Home Secretary, the Commissioner said yesterday that her understanding, because I've read the Times and I heard what the Home Secretary said yesterday, from what I understand about those proposals, I would support them as well. I haven't seen the detail, but absolutely, if it enables police officers to make the streets of London safer and it's done in an efficient, professional, intelligence-led way, I would support those powers.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Right. Who have I got? Andrew, sorry.
Not to detract from anything you've said, Cressida, can I just say from the residents' point of view, because I live in the area, most people go away if they possibly can these days. A lot of people spend a lot of money in trying to put up holding, which is prohibitively expensive for most people. But I have to say, I can't say that I've seen any difference in the low-level vandalism and theft to property over the last, I don't know how many years, including this year. I mean, I came home to a stolen dustbin and excrement in my front basement, which is what we usually have every year. So whilst it may be well have been successful from the wider policing point of view, I hope you will take into account the impact more generally, because I don't think our experience is any different to anybody else's. I'd also say there's been a huge upsurge in graffiti in the area, which may or may not be linked to Carnival. And I don't know, people putting their tags as a sort of advert before it happens or afterwards. But this is the sort of thing that seems to be linked around Carnival all the time in residents' experience. I don't want to see Carnival banned. I think it's a great event. But I'm just saying a bit of reality check from the residents' point of view as well in relation to the policing operation.
Well, the comments I made yesterday are, it is relative. Yeah. And, I still said yesterday, I feel it is an unacceptable crime generator, and it still has risks of safety and security that I am not at all comfortable with. In terms of antisocial behaviour, one of the tones we're really clear, and I saw the briefing with the officers, is, if you don't like the look of it, do something about it. Now, clearly, they have to focus, particularly at the busiest times, on the most serious things and their particular tasking. But they are asked and do, not walk by, to keep searching for knives, which they were doing when they weren't busy with other things, to keep challenging people if there is antisocial behaviour. There are more, I couldn't help but notice, more sort of portaloo, if that, I'm not advertising here, the right word, facilities than there've ever been. There were lots of places people could use toilet facilities, and yet, as you say, there's still, partly through too many people having too much to drink and or being under the influence of other things, and just kind of general antisocial behaviour, there is a huge impact, I do understand, on the people who live in that area. There really is. I can't speak for the graffiti. I'll go away and have a think about that one.
Well, Len. Oh, sorry, so impolite me. Sean, I do apologise.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to go back to pre-carnival activity and communications. You mentioned that 1,000 people were arrested during the 6 weeks before. We've been out with the Violent Crime Task Force, who are in a much more routine way now, targeting with intelligence-led raids on people who might commit violent crime, who have got weapons, that sort of thing. Last year, we were concerned, many members of the public, some people on social media, were concerned about the communication of activity before Carnival as pre-Carnival raids, i.e. linking things to Carnival that may not have been specifically to do with Carnival. This year, though, and we asked about this before the Carnival as well, and we looked at it very closely to see what communication was like. It was much more positive. Everything I saw from the police was much more like this was a routine thing. It wasn't, in my view, bringing any kind of sense of alarm around Carnival, that people should be worried or be deterred from going. I thought that was much better. So I wanted to ask, what was there a plan for that? Did you listen to the feedback last year? And how do you feel like the communication side of things went from a police point of view?
So we had lots of positive feedback on the communicators and the communication plan all round. So the public information and the various different ways that you could get it was praised. The tone that was set throughout was praised. The clarity around the Section 60 and the stakeholder communication, and the fact that the event organisers supported. So I would agree and pay tribute to those who were involved in the communications plan. Of course, we are always communicating to a very wide range of audiences, the most important people who need to hear that we are doing everything we can to stop violence at Carnival are the people who are intent on violence at Carnival. And one way that we have sought to do, to both to reassure the public and to reach them in the past, has been to talk about it very, very overtly beforehand. This time, it was a change, and we did decide that our very high levels of operational activity, higher than ever, Sean, and very clearly linked to Carnival, nevertheless, we would not be screaming and shouting and saying, here's another Carnival-related arrest. We would simply go and do it, and talk to those people and get messages out through the criminal community, through our sources, and to those who we know are violent and might be thinking of coming to Carnival, or are thinking, according to intelligence, coming to Carnival, and telling them either you're arrested now, in old-fashioned parlance, you're nicked to get your trousers on, or, more to the point, we're going to be there. It will be very hard to get into Carnival. We will be doing lots of high-profile operations. There's lots of clever ways in which we will spot you if you're coming to Carnival, all of which appears to have worked. So yes, it's a change. I'm glad you liked it. I don't know whether everybody will have done.
Okay, thank you very much. You've touched on it there. The other thing I wanted to ask about was facial recognition technology. Obviously, I expressed my concerns about its use last year, and we came along to see what was going on there.
Sure.
It's still officially in a trial situation, and so you need to be, and you said you will be trying it out at different kinds of situations, at different kinds of events. So I was very pleased that you decided not to use it again this year. If you were continually targeting Carnival with this, I think it would be a worry. Can I ask, in the spirit of it being a trial, what difference did the absence of facial recognition make? Did you miss it? Was it any use last year? In the spirit of the fact that you are trialling this technology and testing its effectiveness.
We're coming in a minute, don't we? Could you answer that, and then I'm going to take it on a little bit further.
So we are constantly trying out new things, and this year we had several new bits of technology of various different sorts that we used, and I was very pleased with the way they worked. You're right, we didn't continue we are continuing the trial, but we chose not to do it at Carnival this year. I can't really prove a negative. I don't know what would have happened if we did have it there, but you'll be aware that given the very, very, very narrow nature of the trial that we are doing, I wouldn't have expected, if we had it there, large numbers of people to have been arrested as a result, but I can't say what would have happened if we had it there.
Yes, it's wonderful that Notting Hill can lead to all sorts of streams of different conversations. The comment earlier by Sian and the feedback around the comms of last year is very much the view of Sian herself, and not the settled view of the committee, the concerns that you responded to. I think, Len, you wanted to come in.
Thank you very much. I thought, the work that you did pre-Carnival last year was good in terms of that. I think it's even better this year. It seems that you're getting on top of it and you're doing that, and that does all help to a safer Carnival for those who want to enjoy it. I want to, Chair, I'll take your guidance. I want to turn back to spit guards, but I'm happy for you to say carry it over to the violent crime one or continue here. I've got a couple of quick questions to the Commissioner about it, but it's up to you.
Well, the subject has been introduced, fine. So if you want to, but try to be as brief as
be very brief, and some of the issues. Your position, I do not question your commitment to the safety of your officers, and from our perception, we know that police are put in a dangerous environment in carrying out their jobs. As public sector workers, we need to do everything and make sure that we're satisfied to do it. It's an operational decision for you, but we should be asking some of these questions about these circumstances. Wouldn't your position be stronger if the pilot had extended to response teams rather than just in the controlled environment of custody suites? I think you said in your submission earlier on to us that it's a different environment. And I listened very carefully to what you said yesterday during the radio interview. So if, I could really, I was waiting for Ferrari to come back at you and say, well, if it's potentially unsafe or potentially makes life more dangerous for our people on the front line in response to have spit guards, what does that say for custody officers then? Is that controlled environment much? Is that what the premise is? But doesn't the cameras and the body issues make that potentially better, isn't it? If it's about issues of how it's used and when it's used. And really, one of the issues you said yesterday was that even if we did do it, it wouldn't be used that often for those judgment calls, which officers have to make, isn't it? I'd rather have a guard on me than be tasered, to be honest. If there was a choice in the matter of you're a criminal, I suspect they might say that, or being hit with a baton. But nevertheless, some of those that think, the strand of your arguments, I don't quite fully understand. And I understand that in the custody suites, the number of times these guards have been used is running about 3 a week. I get the view that this crime, which is assault, spitting and biting, is
unlawful.
Even though it's unlawful and it might be at the lower end of some of the violence our officers face, it's still assault in court.
Yeah.
Tell me how you've arrived at the judgment, which I have some difficulty with.
Chair, I can see this interests lots of people. I'd be very happy to talk to people outside as well. But just to say, the issue in custody then is exactly the one you say, which is Craig may want to come in here, there are several officers present in custody at any one time. There's always custody officers, plural, and there's always supervisors, plural, and there's always dedicated detention officers, plural. So the environment in which the decision is being made, this person has spat or bitten and is in such a state they are likely to do this again and pose a threat to us, is a decision which is made in the relatively calm environment of the custody office with several people around to look at the different possibilities and tactics and to be able to apply it safely and carefully. By definition. And what we have been doing in the early stages of the pilot and since is dip sampling and looking at the way in which it is being used. We haven't had a single complaint about its usage at all. So it's being used sparingly and it's being used professionally, but in a very, relatively speaking, contained environment. That is the point. Now, those who have real concerns about the guard would say that when you put it on somebody's head, it is potentially highly frightening and makes somebody feel very claustrophobic. And on top of being restrained in other ways, whether that is handcuffs or other physical restraint by the officers and leg restraints sometimes, very rare again, that this could lead to an excited delirium reaction, which is, but the medical evidence does not suggest that it is a dangerous thing to do, but it does create, in those who are looking at it, being applied, a sense that this is a sort of, for want of a better word, oppressive thing to do. Which, when you look at some of those violent videos that you have seen, as I say, if you imagine the officers struggling also to put the spit guard on the head whilst trying to restrain somebody, it would be A, probably impossible, B, more likely to get them a good kicking than they would otherwise do. These are fine decisions on the street, but they're also fine decisions for me.
I'm only going to intercede in what we're going to also ask for, Len, is a separate briefing for the committee on the pilot evaluation.
Why not in one of your sessions we'll get you to the officer safety training, see the guards, see how it works, and just to pick up on your point, because I think it's a really good point you made about could you learn. Matt Twist, as some of you will know, one of our Deputy Assistant Commissioners, is the national lead on this. There are 32 forces to learn from with their environments of how they're using it, and also some of the things that are working well outside London and some of those areas where it doesn't. So there is some learning from the operational environment already.
I agree that in terms of learning environment, but in terms of that, should we not commit ourselves to doing an evaluated pilot from response to see if those issues are borne out? Because I think, Commissioner, you're right, you've got a judgment call to make, but actually people that are in those situations have got a judgment call. If I'm a police officer, I've got a range of tools to use and decide when it's appropriate to use them. I may decide, if someone starts to, that I'm in that situation where I don't want to use the spit guard for all sorts of reasons. There may be a tightly different situation where I do. Should the choice not be left to the officer to decide once we've done the evaluation? That's really where I'm coming from, of trying to understand if we allow it in one part of the organisation, why is it not? Because all those tools of defence or offence, depending on the situation that police officers find themselves in, are things that they don't automatically use. They don't automatically go for, in terms of the baton, they don't automatically go for other issues. They have to make those judgment calls. The question we've always done, as we've applied, as you've applied, not we, when I say we, those who are on the side of wanting to put bad people and to stop them causing violence, is the choice is for that officer to decide on the situations. And in that sense, aren't we denying it? I just quickly want to go to
move this on, Len, if
there's
I may.
one issue. In 2014, the MPS settled a civil claim outside of the court because someone was spat at and didn't feel they could defend the issue. The claim was that they weren't officially there. Aren't we opening up ourselves for these issues of legal actions, never mind collective legal actions, individual actions from our employees to you about these circumstances? Now this debate has started in this way, and is it wise that we try to, as I think I think, Commissioner, you were trying to say yesterday that you're open to these discussions, you're open to listen to it, but wouldn't it be better if we did that with moving towards a pilot to actually get to the bottom of those very issues that concern you, but also in terms of just making sure we got the facts before we take these final decisions?
It may well be, Len. So when I brought it in the custody suite, that was my decision. Not everybody agreed with it. Not everyone was happy with it. I pushed it on. I pushed it through. We've done it. It's gone well. And I said, I'm not saying never, but I need to be convinced that it is the right thing to do. Yes, we make balanced decisions about the operational implications of things, long-term and short-term. But yes, we make balanced decisions about the legal implications. So for every officer, I hope not, but who might feel that they've been put at risk from something or other, there'll be another member of the public who will feel exactly the opposite, if you like, and I am open to a legal challenge in that way. That is the nature of the world I work in. I'm often open to legal challenges, but I have a duty to protect my officers, and I completely understand that. At the moment, my view is that duty does not say, obviously and immediately, I need to issue spit guards on the street. I am waiting for the evidence about what's happening in other forces and the evidence from the Federation and others about the prevalence of instances in which it would actually have helped. The vast majority of instances, it wouldn't have helped at all, because you don't know it's going to happen when you get spat out.
I'm going to start, if I may, Commissioner. I'm now going to make an unusual ruling, is that's the end of spit guards for the moment, because we do need to move on. We will no doubt move on to it another time. We are going to ask DAC Matt Twist to come and brief us more fully on the pilots and evaluation. We can bring up the subjects that others have raised and to return to the subject. Good. We're now going to move on, if we may, and I'd like to make the point on the record to thank officers for what they did on those 3 days.
Thank you.
And how they protect the children. Now, I'm going to move on because we don't have a great deal of time. We've all had our opportunity of spit guards. For today anyway. Tackling violence is the next subject, which is a subject we always make sure we return to, about the level of violent crime and the comment of the Commissioner, particularly around stabilisation, potential reduction. I think, Caroline, you're going to lead on it.
Thank you very much indeed. Looking at the latest report we've had from the Mayor's office, it shows that knife crime offences have risen by 12% and gun crime discharges by 18% compared to the previous year, though I think some areas may have slightly decreased. Commissioner, you recently sort of stressed again that you think violence levels are beginning to stabilise. But what reassurance is that really for Londoners? And, you know, the public, I think, are rightly worried about this. People are worried children are back at school this week. People are very worried about people in their community. Do you have latest figures that really confirm your line that they're stabilising? And can you perhaps give us a bit more context around this worrying trend?
Yes, I can. So I would still use the word stabilisation, although I appreciate that that is not of itself the most reassuring of words. I also fully recognise that people are concerned. Many people are very concerned, and many people are concerned who actually will never come across a violent incident, but because they're seeing all this media attention and the conversations about some of the ghastly things that have been happening, they feel quite fearful that it could happen to them. So I totally understand that. I use the word in the context of month on month, almost continuous, since 2014, in almost every violent crime category, increases. And we are now seeing a plateau, or in some categories, a beginnings of a reduction, which I am determined will go right down in, again and again and again. So if I talk about just 4 quick categories for you, the one that we are always most concerned about is the knife injury victims under 25. So these are people who've been stabbed, who are young, and you understand why we are so concerned about that, and the volumes have been very high in London. They've been increasing for several years. They have been decreasing, broadly speaking, continuously since May. That results in even a 12-month rolling period now. We're seeing a reduction. So the last 12 months is better than the previous 12 months. That is quite a beginnings of a coming down, which I am determined will go further and further, and thanks to the Violent Crime Task Force and others for that. Total gun crime is also down. And as you are aware, one of the sort of very high-profile issues, moped-enabled crime. If I compare the last 4 months' figures with the same time in 2017, that's down nearly 50%, very nearly 50%. That's a huge reduction. So there are other crime categories within violence, as you know, and when I take it as a whole, I would, describe a chart that's gone up like that for more than a year in most cases since 2014, and is now beginning to go either like that or down like that. It's still too high. I said when I became Commissioner it was too high, and I want it to be driven right down. And we are determined to do that, and we're doing some, you've been out with the VCTF, you see the efforts that they are putting into this and the volumes of arrests and seizures. Over 4,000 arrests since April, 1,500 knives taken off the streets, nearly 200 firearms. And this isn't one big seizure of lots of firearms. These are guns taken off, very violent people. Often at the time they're thinking of either carrying it or about to use it. 600 other weapons. We're very, very busy on street and gun violence, knife and gun violence on the streets, and we're having lots and lots of successes, lots of people being locked up, lots of the most violent criminals feeling not either that they're likely to get arrested any minute, or at least that it's not wise to carry a weapon out there.
So your analysis is you've reached the peak.
I really have.
Yes. Starting to tell off. I recall back in 2014-15 raising this with the former commissioner, and I was told it was a seasonal blip when I said it looks to me like knife crime's going up, and I was told it was a seasonal blip, and actually it clearly has. It
depends which category you're talking about, I guess, Caroline. I can't speak for that, but many of them started in 2014. Yes, some of them started later in 2015 to go up.
It's been going up, but you feel it's sort of reached the peak.
And I do also, of course, always say, as I know Sophie would, the rises that you're seeing in London are percentage-wise less than much of the rest of the country and many other cities, and indeed per head of population. I haven't done the detailed analysis of this, but I understand that in many of the violent crime categories per head of population, even when you don't allow for all our visitors, London is actually suffering less violent crime per head of population than some cities.
But for the ordinary person on the street, seeing the paper, seeing the news, knowing people who've been affected, knowing that's just down the street from me,
horrible.
They're really worried. You've got the violent crime task force, which obviously we have met with. Are they still operating at full capacity? Do you see the need to put more resources in them? How sustainable is this going forward, given the pressures right across the force?
So they are operating at full capacity, they are very busy, they are highly motivated, they're doing a great job, and they are supported by the firearms teams, by Trident, by the organised crime teams, by the National Crime Agency and borough police in all sorts of ways. So everybody is really focused on street violence together. They will carry on. We're constantly reviewing the tactics, and those are developing all the time. We're getting better and better and better at lots of things. And as we go into the autumn, the crime profiles tend to change a little bit. People will be concerned about earlier darkness, potential for robbery. We'll be changing some of the ways in which they work and where they work, and I will be looking hard at whether we need to bring any more into any aspect of that from other areas of my resource. And of course, at the same time, we are trying to recruit a lot of people because we have more money this year than we actually expected, and very welcome it is too. So we're busy recruiting and recruiting and recruiting.
So that's across the wider force and general recruitment. But do you see that you may need to look at expanding this team going forward?
I would certainly not rule out expanding the team. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is it sustainable? Given you've had to sort of take those officers from elsewhere to focus on this bit of work, you've got to backfill those. Is this sustainable?
Yes, absolutely sustainable. So part of the work that goes along this, as Commissioner touched on, is very much about getting the recruitment plan going. So as you know, at the moment we're actually in that position with finance where we can actually increase our recruitment profile. So that's one of the big things at the moment. You can help us with that. We want people to come and join the Met. It's a great place to be, and come and join it and be part of it. So growing those numbers will help in terms of that sustainability. It's also about using some of those resources, as Cress touched on, that are taskable and are in the Met most of the time. So as you may well know, I chair the performance group. The main focus, number one item, is always violence. It's looking at what is actually going on, what lies behind it, what can we see around the trends in terms of what's going, and where are those things blips. So what is seasonality in some of these things, and where are they real? As Cress touched on, we know that as we approach October, change of the hour, those sorts of things, so the autumn nights effect is a real effect. You see that every year in crime patterns. You see that particularly in street robbery changes as you go up to that. And street robbery involving knives is one of the things we're using that focus about. So you will see that momentum continue. We always look at whether we can reprioritise all the time resources from one part of the organisation to elsewhere. We've done that all of, and that's part of what we will continue to do as part of this work.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And can I come to the Deputy Mayor now? You've got an evidence and insight team, and they look at, dedicated to analysing violence and really we want to understand what type of analysis is it carrying out? How are you really getting behind the data, some of these issues, which can then help with the officers and the tasking?
We do have a very good evidence and insight team that works very closely with the analysts in the Metropolitan Police as well. One of the things it's done, and it's now on the website, I hope you've seen it, is the knife crime dashboard, which is absolutely has a up-to-date information on the prevalence of violent crime in London. As with all the dashboards, you can click down to ward level to see what's happening. That is of use to the general public, but actually it's of use to practitioners and stakeholders. It is being used all the time in terms of the information that is available, in terms of sort of prioritisation, and it's certainly something that we work with Metropolitan Police with, and it's used jointly. So in that terms, it's just about the prevalence, which actually helps in terms of prioritisation and the work that needs to take place. And of course, there's also the work that we do through the Public Attitude Survey to understand the perceptions and the experience of the public in London, as well as the young people in London. A specific piece of work that was carried out in the run-up to the knife crime strategy was talking to young people about their experiences of knife crime, experiences of violence in the most difficult areas in London. It was a very focused piece of work. So the evidence and insight team is continually looking at what is happening, analysing what is happening, and sharing that with the Met to ensure that it goes into operational decision making.
Obviously that's knife crime, there's lots of other forms of violence.
And the dashboard has gun crime and other forms.
Okay.
It's on the website.
How are you using accident and emergency data? Because you have been criticised, quite rightly, that not every A&E department is sharing anonymised data. That is so important and is a proven model from Cardiff that it really can help bring down violent crime, using data, really targeting. How are you using that to help with the work of the Met in this area?
So you'll know, because I think I wrote to the committee, but I certainly did write to you around the accident emergency units. There's 28 of the 29 accident emergency units in London are routinely sharing that data. It has been used. It's been used by the partnership as well as the police in terms of actual operational decision making. I've said before to in front of you, this committee, a couple of the examples of how that data sharing has helped with the acid attacks in East London, as well as another, looking at where some of the violence was taking place that wasn't being reported to the police. We know that there is violence that isn't reported, and through that, absolutely through the data that's collected at the accident and emergency units, that can be used. So it's 28 out of the 29. The last hospital with the accident and emergency unit that is not yet routinely sharing, it is a technical issue around data sharing that it has been worked through. I don't totally accept the criticisms around the use of data. It is used, it is being shared properly, systematically. There is just that one accident and emergency unit that's just getting on board, and we're working through those details. I think I said last time I was here that I opened up a conference around in the living room, London living room upstairs, on information sharing to tackle violence, and the leading medical practitioner in accident emergency medicine, I'm sure that's not the right phrase, but you know what I mean, said that London was leading the way on this in terms of actually the number of hospitals who were data sharing, and that we are working to expand that into some of the other units in London as well.
I just find it frustrating, for the last decade when I was on the police authority, I had meetings about this, trying to get them all on board, and then you're still here 10 years later with all this violence on the streets and
It is just
Not
one.
everyone.
It
I
is
know,
just
but
one.
it's still
28 out of the 29
Yeah,
accidents
yeah.
emergency units in London are
I know,
routinely
it's
showing
crazy,
this data.
but-
And they will be ready soon. And it's not because of lack of will. It is the technical issues around the programmes and things.
Okay.
So.
But as Deputy Mayor, are you satisfied that your office, MOPAC, is adequately addressing violence as a wider issue than knife crime and the involvement of young people? Because there's all sorts of aspects, from domestic violence to others, and we've touched on gun crime as well. Are you really assured that every aspect is being covered?
So I think if you spoke to officers in MOPAC, probably the first thing they'll say is that I'm never satisfied because there's always more to be done, as Cress has talked about in terms of the figures and what looks like, as Commissioner talks about, looks like stabilisation at the moment. That's still not enough. It is still too high. And when you are a family of a murder victim or a family of a stab victim, you're never going to be rightly satisfied that enough is being done. So we're constantly pushing that and constantly working with the local authorities, the NHS and our partners and communities to make sure more is being done. Am I satisfied that we have the right strategy, the right principles and framework? Yes, I am, because it is very much around enforcement, prevention and early intervention, but absolutely more needs to be done, and we all have to continue to drive it, because otherwise what looks like the early signs of stabilisation won't be early signs of stabilisation, because everybody has to be absolutely on this and on this all the time, because it really matters. It matters to Londoners, and as you said, people are beginning to, well, they are feeling unsafe, worried, and rightly, because it is very worrying and concerning what is happening.
Yeah. Lovely, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And the committee obviously is continuing its work on that. You'll be aware that we're a day out on Friday. We're visiting Birmingham to continue our work on violent crime, hopefully working towards publishing a report October time, around then, autumnal, shall we say. Or,
Now, if I was you, I'd be going, go on, give us a date.
Exactly.
Okay, moving on to the next subject, EU exit security and policing. Unusually, this will be Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. We've discussed this before. About this time last year, the government published a position paper saying that they wanted a new security treaty. I'm not sure how far that's got. In November last year, Sophie, you said that if we didn't have a clear understanding by the first quarter of 2018, you were going to be seriously concerned about what it means for individual police inquiries, individual police operations. I don't think we are any clearer. The three main forms of cooperation: Europol, they've said we can't remain members of Europol after leaving the EU. European arrest warrant, Michel Barnier has said we won't be part of that, and the only time that's been parallel negotiations have taken place took 13 years to negotiate for Norway and Iceland. Information sharing is going to be an issue in relation to data protection and so forth. We've got the mayor's six red lines. So I suppose the question is to you, Chris. Are you now planning for a no-deal scenario?
Short answer is yes. I'm going to ask Craig to talk a little bit about the measures that you've mentioned, and then I'll come back in on other contingencies.
So yes, we are planning for that in terms of doing it. You may be aware, if you're not, just so you're aware, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Richard Martin is the national lead for us, as in for policing. He's working with the National Crime Agency, and they're looking at what the loss of effectively what we call 40 instruments will be. So you described a number of things. There are some real practical examples. So a patrolling officer will not get, if there is no deal on security, a patrolling officer will not get alerts from international networks that they would currently get. We will know less about people from this country travelling aboard committing criminality than we would do in the current arrangements. So what we've been doing with the National Crime Agency, and when I say we, I mean UK policing, is looking at what would we need to put in place to do that. It won't surprise you that to replicate those that speed that we've currently got is almost impossible to do. So what we will have, though, are some workarounds and some quite, I think we call them clumsy, they're cumbersome methods and systems that will allow us through going through basically a central referrals scheme that we'll have to set up to go in and access data in that way. but a lot of the things that we currently get real time, we won't get. Now that work is ongoing in terms of that, but that is a real strand of planning that we're doing, National Policing and the National Crime Agency, in terms of being able to address those issues and be realistic with people about these are the capabilities you've currently got. If there is no deal in this particular area, this is what it means, and this is what these things look like.
So, Cressida wanted to.
On the sort of wider issues, not sort of policing and security specific, but were there to be a so-called no-deal scenario, you'll be aware that the government are looking at all the possible sort of impacts, and we in policing, led by Chief Constable Charlie Hall, have a small team working alongside government departments, and we, the Met, of course, have put some resource into that team and are in very close touch with that team. So in essence, they will be working through the potential impacts in terms of, first of all, sort of our public order work. So, is there likely to be planned protests? Of what sort? How will that be policed? What are the issues at the borders? Will that, if there are, hypothetically queues, what will that mean in terms of policing? And any other disorder type issues, and then working alongside the government to see what they think are the impacts on various different sectors. We've seen talk about pharmaceuticals, for example. We've talked about food. Then, in a very sensible, sober way, we are looking at that alongside the government departments. And of course, the London Resilience Forum will be an important part of this thinking as well.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's a question for Craig next. I mean, looking at the cost of, in the widest sense of a no-deal Brexit, in terms of officer time and financial costs, have you done some work on what all that adds up to?
So we've started to look at, I talked about, so effectively losing access to systems will require us to put people at the centre, and we've been asked to develop a position as to what that will be, and that work is ongoing as we speak. That will be a relatively, in the scheme of things, a relatively small cost. Sadly, the cost will fall out in various parts of policing around the country where it will take longer to do inquiries, it will take longer to conduct investigations without access to those things we've currently got. And I suspect the reality is some investigations won't progress. It will be far more difficult to progress some investigations when you go back to either bilateral agreements or some of the restrictions that we used to have on doing investigations across borders.
I presume that includes counter-terrorism as well?
Well, potentially yes. I mean, you can't assume counter-terrorism's different for this. One of the great advantages we've always had is that ability to share police-to-police intelligence and those sorts of things. A lot of that can disappear without some of these mechanisms, and particularly the automatic way it's done. I mean, many of you have been out with officers across London. You will know that they get alerts, they get things. What you probably don't know sometimes is some of those have come from European systems. They won't get those.
So potentially, we're going to be less secure.
Well, that's absolutely a potential, and it will certainly be slower to achieve that level of security.
Okay.
I genuinely don't think you can underestimate the impact of sort of crashing out of the EU without proper frameworks and proper, a proper deal on security. Never mind the rest of the stuff on security. Because Craig and the Commissioner have talked about things being more clunky, more difficult. You can't underestimate it. I mean, there's two things in my briefing, for, just as examples. Before the European arrest warrant was introduced, there were 60 individuals a year that were extradited from the UK. Now, because we have the European arrest warrant, the UK surrenders over 10,000 individuals accused or convicted of a criminal offence. That's just a step change. There will be a step change backwards if we crash out of the EU without a proper deal on this. And then there's the Schengen Information System 2, SIS2, which during 2017 there were 93,832 UK hits on that system from non-UK alerts. When you talk about alerts, I was concerned in November. I am really, really worried that if we don't get a proper deal on security, London and the country is going to be less safe.
So following up from that, Sophie, we know the Mayor's got the 6 red lines, and I won't list them for want of time. Have you, stroke the Mayor, made any progress with the government and or the EU on those 6 red lines? And also, I saw that the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners call for contingency plans at the least to be in place by March next year. Has any progress been made on contingency plans by March next year, as they've asked for?
So, as Commissioner Cressida's already and Craig have talked about, there are contingency plans being put in place. That I don't wish to, as I said, it is a small amount of comfort in that, because those contingency plans mostly will involve an officer ringing up and asking. Yeah. In the old days, it would have been faxing or whatever. In terms of have we made progress on 6 red lines, no, we haven't made progress. Myself and the Mayor did go and have a meeting with David Davis before he resigned. We are waiting to get a meeting with Dominic Raab on a number of issues, but obviously for me the most important issue that I need to be really concerned about is security. We haven't. You can see from what's happening with the Brexit negotiations, there is very, very little progress, and there's very little comfort in what is happening. And
just going back to something that Cress raised, which is something I hadn't really thought about, and that's the potential public order implications, not of a security no deal, but of the wider issues. We've heard this sort of, I don't know if they're scare stories or genuine risks of food shortages, pharmaceutical shortages, huge queues at the borders, potentially creating other pressures. Well, that is part of it, because it comes down to the policing demands of it, and in fact the Commissioner actually raised this in her wider analysis. I think that's a new aspect which we hadn't really thought about. I don't know if you can say any more about that, Chris. Yeah.
I think I've said we're involved in planning. We're working with the government. Okay, yeah. You would expect us to be looking ahead and making contingency plans.
Deputy Mayor, I think you're managing to write Andrew's speech for tomorrow by the sound of it, which is first class. Now, Tony, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I was struck by what Craig had to say about the large number of hits that we had for using their resources. Tell me, how frequently do European police forces make use of your facilities and your intelligence facilities?
I don't have the reciprocal. It will be an awful lot.
Indeed it would. Isn't it a fact that there is a kind of esprit de corps amongst police forces, not just across Europe, but really across the world, where they seek to cooperate and they seek to cut red tape?
Absolutely, but they need a legal framework to do that.
Well, indeed. Is it absolutely realistic? It has to be a question, I suppose, for the Deputy Mayor.
I'm not a politician.
It can't possibly be a question. Do you really think that the awesome picture that you have raised, the Mayor's red lines and the stuff that we have just had from Assembly Member Dismore about people queuing in the streets and riot and all this sort of stuff, how have you and the Mayor's office actually tested that gloomy hypothesis to say that these things will happen, set against the point that I've just made about in policing, in security and all of these matters, there has always been a supranational cooperation which will continue to remain?
That's some question.
No, it's not for you.
That's reassuring.
It's for the Deputy Mayor. I want to know what testing the Mayor has done, instead of him going around and posturing, saying it is the end of the world as we know it. Patently isn't.
So in terms of, esprit de corps is one thing, will to and absolute goodwill to cooperate is another, and I completely agree with you. The police forces in Europe will absolutely want to cooperate in the interest of their own national security, but international security as well. We had the discussion at the beginning of this committee was around extremism, international terrorism. We are all linked. We are all absolutely linked. But police forces have to act within legal frameworks. If those legal frameworks fall, whatever the esprit de corps is, you cannot do that data sharing on such a level as it is now. So we know that because of the legal frameworks that need to be in place. It should be, I agree with you, it should be absolutely incomprehensible and unrealistic to think we might get to that place. However, The juggernaut is rolling. We do not have those legal frameworks in place at the moment. My concern is time is running out, and we know what will happen if those legal frameworks are not in place, because we have the figures, the data, and the examples where it has made such a difference to be able to use those legal frameworks.
Well, I'm pleased that you accept that there is this, and you talk about manifestly there has to be some kind of legal framework, no matter how obstinate you may think, and clearly from my point of view, the Europeans are in this matter. It really is, isn't it, inconceivable that in this area of cooperation that there will not be a separate agreement relating to security. I understand that you have to make plans for it, but it isn't conceivable in the 21st century that it will actually happen. And for people to go around saying that it is possible that it's going to happen, and it's going to lead to some kind of Armageddon, really is fear-mongering of the most terrible sort. I'll end there, Chairman. Really.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As ever, a wise intervention by Assembly Member Harbour. Now we're going to move directly to Andrew's question around professional standards. We'll leave the public counsel till colleagues go, and we'll do you last, if we may. So, Andrew.
In July 2018, it was reported that the Director of Professional Standards is being investigated by the Independent Office of Police Conduct following claims of, quote, serious corruption and malpractice. And we understand that one officer is under criminal investigation, 2 disciplinary investigation for gross misconduct, and the IOPC is looking at 10 other officers. Commissioner, you said you've got confidence in the department and you object to the investigation being labelled as one of corruption. So perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the investigation and the likely timescales for progress on it.
So this is an investigation that is being run by the IOPC, as you say. Obviously, if anybody makes allegations about people within working within Professional Standards Department, then it's not appropriate for that department to be investigating itself, and therefore it is entirely appropriate that the IOPC are investigating. I would make the point that I think they generally make, which is the fact that notices have been served is just that. It's putting people on notice in order that they can, if you like, gather their arms to answer the accusations. It is no more than that. But as you say, we have confirmed that notices have been served on a very small number of people. My point that I've made more widely is that I think it is easy to bandy around the word corruption, and it means a lot of different things to different people, but when you look in the law, it's fairly clear, and it's a fairly narrow set of circumstances. And of course, in the history of law enforcement, and not excluding the Met, there have been occasions of corruption, including of, historically, 20 and 40 years ago, large numbers of officers in particular areas. What I objected to in the coverage was the suggestion that this investigation was about corrupt officers covering up corrupt officers. I simply, on the basis of what I know, do not accept that this is what it is, and I continue to say that I have confidence in my Professional Standards Department and the people in there who do important, difficult work, and I think they do it very well. We will see, of course, what happens with these allegations, which are still at an early stage, need to be fully investigated, no doubt, by the IOPC, and of course I fully respect their process and wherever they end up. But it is an investigation which could have caused alarm, I think, for people, and I wanted to put some and I still want to put some context on it. And allegations have been made. They are being investigated. We are at very early stages, and my understanding from the IOPC, although I will be continuously urging them because of the importance of it in terms of reputation, to be as fast as possible and actually to be proportionate and to keep reviewing where they are getting to. I cannot say how long it will take, but it will be months, not weeks, quite clearly.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I don't think anyone would question that it's right for the IOPC to do this, bearing in mind that we are looking at the Professional Standards Department itself. But I think it is very worrying that this is actually taking place in relation to the Director of Professional Standards. But to put it in context, how many officers do you have in this directorate?
Well, in terms of the entire directorate, there are, gosh, I can't remember the head count off the top of my head, there's about 800 across the various parts of those teams, split into various things, from counter-corruption teams all the way through. So, we keep a perspective. We do get complaints, concerns raised about professional standards. That's the nature of the types of investigations they get involved in. It's not always welcome when professional standards turn up, and people do complain about it. And so it's not completely abnormal. These things do happen. That's why in this case it's with the IOPC.
Well, I think that puts in context. We're talking about a relatively small number of officers.
It's not
like what happened in Sir Robert Mark's day. Let's put it.
No.
It could, honestly, that is my point, Andrew. It could not be further from that, from those scenarios. And that's why I found some of the coverage offensive on behalf of that department. I will, of course, stand by whatever they find, but we are not dealing in any sense at all with something that should remind us of historic corruption scandals in the Met. We're not.
That's reassuring. Linden, do you want to come in?
If not to second guess what's going on and not to imply anything, but really about outcomes and judgment calls on investigations that take place, I presume there's always going to be parameters and choices made on cases.
Yes.
Who checks the checkers around those outcomes to see if anyone is pulling any punches about what judgment calls they can? And is there a consistency about them?
Yeah.
So they ain't, if they're not doing favours for mates or networks within networks or around that. So what's the process that's in place?
So there's a number of things in place, not least of which over the last 2 years we've strengthened quite considerably the senior management oversight in that area. So I think you know that we've got an Assistant Commissioner, Helen Ball, who sits in professionalism. We've got a Deputy Assistant Commissioner, we've got a Commander, we've got a Chief Superintendent actually in charge of the DPS. So there's the management structure and oversight of outcomes as part of the monitoring of the business that goes on in DPS. That's absolutely standard. The IOPC also have ongoing relationships with the DPS in terms of doing it, and part of what they raise is what's going on with consistency around this, be it not enough cases are resolved, let's say, through local resolution as opposed to other processes. That is quite normal in terms of doing it. And at various times, cases get highlighted and raised, and then others of us across the organisation, including myself, will go in and have a look.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, the next question, indeed the last question for colleagues until we return to the front counters, is around the recent issues around DBS checks. Well, Len, do you want to take this one? This is yours.
Okay,
we've got time for it.
I'm aware of that changes took place within the organisation, and I think you did some consultation about this particular change. I suppose it's important for this committee to understand the management of the risk, and can you give the background, just remind us why the change took place, to be honest?
Yeah, of course I can. So it might help if I do a bit of the national context and then quite quickly into what we're talking about. For members who aren't aware, DBS Disclosure and Barring Service, across the country, they get about 4.2 million applications for people to be checked. And there are a variety of tiers of check. That might be as simple as an employment check, all the way through to what they call home working. About 2.8 million of those then get passed to forces. So the 43 forces across the country will all have a unit similar to ours, where they will then run the checks against systems. Now, it's really simple. If I've got a great big record of convictions on PNC, Police National Computer, I'll come up and those are available. The more complex ones are where there are intelligence hits. So actually, from that great big funnel at the top, only across the country, bear in mind nationally, about 9,500 what they call disclosures of information are actually made. So it's a huge funnel that comes to a very small number. We disclose in about just under 1% of cases. 0.88, I think, was our last figures. So it's a really small number you get. Put more people into the pot to be checked. What that does, and what it did for us, certainly through 15 and 2016, is it put huge backlogs in the system. And if you're an employer, those backlogs in some ways are as challenging as not getting the checks back, because you really don't know whether you should take a chance on keeping, shall I take Craig on anyway, because I'm short of people. So the issue of addressing the backlogs was as important for us as getting through the checks. And we set up then, we call it a gold group, but it was basically an oversight group from management board with colleagues from the Disclosure and Barring Service, National Police Chiefs Council, and colleagues from the Home Office who lead on policy on this, to look at the decision making we had. In some cases, we were over-checking. We also had some challenges with our IT not being as joined up as it should be, but we were over-checking and over-managing some of the risk. So we looked at where we could take some risk-based decisions to try and work our way through the backlog in terms of doing it, and that was particularly around those checks from people who were outside our area, what we call non-home-based working, where they just got traces. We decided to make some decisions about, with some of those cases, about moving them through the system quicker, dip sampling to check the risk around it, then bringing in national colleagues to dip sample what we've done, and that's what we did as part of working through the backlog. At no point have we changed the risk to people in terms of what we're doing, and we comply with the national standards around checks. We've not compromised anyone's safety in terms of doing it. We will always face a challenge of, if you put more people into that DBS system, you'll create a backlog again. And that's not, I hasten to add, that is not a criticism of the Disclosure and Barring Service. Policing gets funded for this, but it's about a 12-month delay. So if you say to someone your work rises by 12% on the 1st of January, but your resources will come and join you on the 31st of December, that's always going to be a challenging year. So it is one of those things we work through. We are working, as part of this work, our relationship with the Disclosure and Barring Service is very good. We're working with them nationally and the National Police Chiefs lead to see if there is a better national solution to this process. Because effectively what we experienced in 2016, other forces are experiencing now. And if you can imagine you're a small force in a part of the country, you might only have 4 or 5 people doing this work. 2 of them retire, you half your workforce in this space and your backlog goes up. So we're looking at, is there a potential to create a national solution? Part of that is an IT product.
And originally, when this was in the public domain, it talked of the figure of 20,000 people passing through the system unchecked.
No, so everyone who goes through gets checked. There's no unchecking. There's checks, and it, again, I would make the offer. It might be one of those things you want to come and have a look at, because, frankly, the devil is in the detail in this one. So it's really easy, and I think most members of the public observing this understand when someone's got a criminal record. It's really clear how you do it. It's the contentious area and the difficult areas around decisions are when there are intelligence traces, and is that intelligence trace relevant to what people are doing? So some of the things people wrestle with, with some of these checks, we need 5 years of your address history. Well, what happens if I've just come to the country or previously lived elsewhere and I haven't got 5 years of address history? Can I be checked? Can I not be checked? Do I automatically get excluded? Am I barred from home working? So there is a huge level of complexity behind this that is worth having a look at. But to reassure, people get checked, people go through the system. And I'd say the other thing you'll want to look at is this is a huge funnel going to a very, very few people at which we nationally and locally make disclosures about.
And just been reminded by a colleague, and Brexit will have an impact on this?
Gosh.
Sorry.
There is a theme emerging
according
here.
To some of my colleagues, it will only have a minor impact. Could you just explain a little bit more, just so we understand that?
It could do. But it could do, but again, with deference to other colleagues in the room, it will entirely depend on access to information systems. This is truly something that relies on information.
In the UK, in London, would be either New Year's Eve, which is probably the closest, or Pride, which is quite big.
Okay, and so take New Year's Eve. Do we have 45 officers hurt at New Year's Eve?
I'd have to check the last figures. I don't know.
It's
certainly, there's certainly New Year's Eve is now very much Central London New Year's Eve, of course, is highly regulated and very well controlled in all sorts of ways, and ticketed event, and is very safe and secure. Wider New Year's Eve celebrations that go on do result, I'm sorry to say, in all sorts of arrests for drunken offences, assaults and disorder, and I'm sure we have had officers injured on New Year's Eve.
Yeah, I mean, the point I'm trying to make is
Yes.
I find it absolutely horrific that we've got one event a year that we know we're going to get police officers injured. People that go there choose to go there. Our police officers are ordered to go there. And it just absolutely astounds me that this happens every single year. It gets more and more difficult. The cost implications are sky high, and you're so short of funding, which we understand. But to send our police officers to an event where we know that some of their colleagues are going to get injured, I find absolutely extraordinary. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I'm going to leave it at that now, Andrew. Sorry.
Can I just follow up once your thought?
No one's taking notes of chairman anymore.
We've had the number of injuries.
Chaos reigns.
Yeah. Are all the injuries that you report the result of assaults or some accidents?
There are some slips and trips, but these are the vast majority of them are, most of them actually, are during the course of a detention or of an arrest. Right. So it is when people are struggling and everybody falls on the floor and somebody hurts their finger. Some of them, though, spits, bites. Some of them are more direct assaults. The vast majority are in the course of carrying out a function. Very few, but a couple of years ago there certainly were some where utterly uninvolved people wanted to carry out utterly unprovoked attacks on police, which is even more unacceptable than what happens during the course of, I don't know why I keep trying to arrest crime. You know what I mean?
Put a spit guard on it.
Have colleagues exhausted their trains of thought
Yes.
now? Not really, but for the moment. Right, before you go, Cressida, anything else you want to add?
Yes, Commissioner. Sorry, I do want to say just one very quick thing, Chair. Firstly, to apologise for looking at my phone a little bit in the last hour. I have seen some colleagues here also looking at their phones, and I imagine some of you will have seen something of the news conference which Neil Basu did which was broadcast after 11 o'clock this morning. So Neil Basu was accompanied, and you'll see it afterwards, by Sue Hemming from London CPS and also the Chief Medical Officer. And he was able to tell people that we have reached a very significant point today in the investigation in relation to the attempted murders of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury, and that there are, as the CPS said, is sufficient evidence to charge two Russian nationals. We released images of two suspects this morning. Both are Russian nationals and about 40 years old, and we are appealing for witnesses. The two suspects were in London between the 2nd and the 4th of March at various points. And hence the appeal is also to people who may have been in London at the same time. The Chief Medical Officer I didn't actually see her precise words, but I know the intention, she was there saying that that people who were travelling on the transport that these people may have used, people who were present at the station that these suspects used, are safe, and she has provided a reassuring message about the safety of Londoners and indeed people who were visiting London between the 2nd and 4th of March. I would want to pay tribute to the investigators. They've been doing a very detailed, very diligent, very difficult job, and they have done a great piece of work so far. I pay tribute to the resilience of the people of Salisbury and Wiltshire over the past 6 months, and they have been extremely supportive to the counter-terrorist investigators and other police services. Of course, our thoughts are with Dawn Sturgis's family, who lost her life, and all of the victims during the attacks. We remain absolutely determined to identify and bring about a prosecution in the UK courts of those persons responsible for these attacks, and we will do all we can to get justice for the victims and their families. But just to finish by repeating the Chief Medical Officer's advice is that people who were in London on between the 2nd of March and the 4th of March are safe. And secondly, if anybody does know or recognise the suspects and the images which have been shown across our screens in the last hour and will no doubt in the coming hours, then they should contact us, the police, on 0800 789 321.
Okay. Thank you, Cressida Sucre. We're going to have one more question, but you, I believe you need to go. And thank you for your attendance this morning. I'll let you pack your bag and get ready to go. And then we have one more question to Sophie that Caroline's going to lead on, which is around the recent decision on the judicial review on Wimbledon Police Station. Caroline, you may wish to introduce it.
I'll start now. Obviously, we've expressed our concern before about the consultation around your public access document, your closure of police front counters and stations across the capital. And led by Councillor Paul Kohler, there's been a judicial review, and the High Court judged that Wimbledon Police Station should remain open whilst you further evaluate the impact of things like new technology and so on, and pending further consultation. So what are your next steps regarding Wimbledon Police Station?
So the judicial review did come to an end at the end of July of this year, and the High Court judge did rule that I should look again at the decision around Wimbledon Police Station, but he also ruled that every other front counter closure in London was lawful and could remain. So there was, Councillor Kohler did bring that judicial review for the whole of London, but only the element around Wimbledon Police Station was upheld in
where there was
sense.
The most evidence, but it was also critical of your consultation, saying the structure of the document is incoherent and unhelpful, which is strongly put from the High Court and reflects our own concerns as a committee, but also those from the Institute for Public Consultations or something. I mean, they were highly critical as well.
The High Court judge was very critical of the consultation, as have yourself and members of the committee being critical of that consultation. I accept those criticisms. I absolutely accept that consultation was not as good as it should have been. However, it was lawful, and the vast majority of the front counter closures remain and stand. We are looking at what lessons need to be learnt to make sure that, as I've said to you before, that any other consultation like this is done in a much better way, in a much better way. However, it still stands that this is a consultation that had the most responses to a consultation. I think it's nearly 4,000 responses, public meetings in every borough. But I accept those criticisms. And we need to learn the lessons. In terms of Wimbledon Police Station, the judge ruled that I should, as Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, I need to look again at that decision and review that decision because of the single point which was in the Councillor Kohler's submission around reviewing the internet and the web-based ability to report. I am doing that, and I will continue to do that, and we'll make a decision in due course.
And when will in due course be?
Well,
as you would expect us to ask.
Yeah, no, of course, that's fair enough. We're looking, of course, we are now going back through all the responses that we had specifically for Wimbledon. And in terms of the numbers, we had around 290 written responses in relation to Merton and in relation to Wimbledon Police Station itself. We are going back through all those responses, as is right, because that is what the judge has asked us to do. So once we've concluded that and reviewed the information that we have around the other forms of reporting, I will look at all that detail and make a decision. In due course, I'm not going to rush this. We need to get it right. It is important that we get it right.
So are you expecting by the end of the calendar year you will have made a decision? Or?
As I said, I am not going to rush this. We're looking through all the responses, making sure that we have the right evidence, and we've done a review of the internet-based and the other forms of reporting. I'm not going to put a date on that.
At all.
Okay. But I will be taking that decision, as I said, as soon as I can, but I am not rushing it. I take seriously the take seriously the ruling of the court.
Okay. All the other front counter closures and building closures are going ahead. Has this had any impact on your savings projections?
No, it hasn't in terms of long-term savings projections, because during the course of the judicial review, we did have to put all the, we put the disposals on hold. However, those disposals were not all going to happen in this financial year. There's a rolling programme, so that any impact is minimal. We are now, moving through the disposals that were going to happen this year. Wimbledon Police Station was not online to be sold or disposed of this year, so it's not having an impact at this stage.
Okay. And of course you may consider keeping it open as part of your consideration.
I've got to look at the responses.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Florence?
Just following on from Assemblyman Pigeon on that, in terms of the savings impacts, it was widely reported in BBC this week, I think, some of the figures in terms of sales from the police station closures. You mentioned that the disposals will still be going ahead. Do you have any figures on how much you're looking to make on the disposals that would happen for this year?
I don't have that in front of me in terms of year by year, the capital receipts, the money that we were getting from selling the buildings. I don't have that at the moment in front of me. But overall, we were looking to raise, in the region of, it depends obviously on the market and what happens, of around £165 million. That's capital receipts, which would go straight back into the capital budget and go straight back into making sure that we have the technology that is up to date and needed for modern policing in the capital, but also is there to ensure that the buildings that we do have, we do still have, are fit for purpose and are fit for purpose for modern policing.
Okay, no, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Clearly there's lessons to be learned from MOPAC around consultation. I mean, that's patently obvious. Right, can I again thank the remaining guest for contribution today. Can I ask the committee to note the monthly report from MOPAC in the appendix? Can I ask the committee to note the report and answers given by the Deputy Mayor for Police and Crime to today's questions? Finally, item 7, can I ask the committee to agree the updated work programme as set out in the report, to agree to undertake the site visit to Birmingham on Friday, to agree that our meeting slot on the 20th of September is for activity to support our scrutiny into violent crime, and finally to agree to undertake a scrutiny investigation into volume crime and to use our thematic meeting on the 16th of October to support that scrutiny. Thank you. Date of next meeting, notwithstanding Friday, of course, is Thursday the 20th of September. I have any other urgent business. Thank you, colleagues.
GLA Chamber Sound.